Welcome to Savile Street in Sheffield. So I should say a little bit about why this site matters and why we're here. This is done by commercial archaeologists, sites of this scope and nature. We come to this site once it's been evaluated and it's been determined that there's a sufficient archaeological resource to merit further work. The phase of works we're doing now, which is created everything that you can see around you archaeologically, is referred to as strip map and record. So from the information gathered by the first phases of investigation, so that's desk-based research and evaluation trenching, we determine that there's a significant historical background to this area. The evaluation proves that there's stuff in the ground that's worth investigating. You're getting decent preserved structures with lots of complex relationships and phasing. And that's the kind of thing that we are encouraged to look at as part of the planning process. But what that means for everyone else is that we get to explore the archaeological background to these sorts of sites. The historical nature of these sorts of sites is fairly well understood. There's been a lot of work done by people over dozens and dozens of years correlating all this information about the Sheffield waterways and how these sites developed in the first place. And that's how we knew about the Upper Walk Mill and the Nether Walk Mill, structures like that. But they effectively exist as data points on maps until we get to excavate them. And that's where we really look into the nuts and bolts, the nitty-gritty, the fine-grained structural and deposit relationships that make an archaeological site. Although we're not dealing with a very long period of history necessarily, it's very busy. So there's lots of things to look at, there's lots of structures to excavate and understand. And particularly with a well-preserved site of this nature, we get more of the ephemeral deposits, the more casual things caused by day-to-day activity that aren't necessarily considered something memorable even by the people who are doing it, but they leave their traces in the ground as they go. And on a well-preserved enough site, we get to then re-excavate that and determine who was here, why they were here and what they were doing. The spot I'm standing on was the original location of a water-powered cutlery mill that was built around about 1750. We don't know exactly when it was built because the origins of these structures are a bit more ephemeral than their final phases. But we do know that by about 1780, 1790, this mill employed about 40 to 50 people with a home for 54 individual grinding troughs, which are the actual structures where the cutlery grinding happens. The structure you can see in front of you is a reconfigured rebuild of that original phase. The elevation you can see before you bordered the water channel that came through from the River Don behind you, ran through the site off to this side and had an interceptor weir that funneled off more water in this direction. So if you imagine a huge rotating water wheel in this wheel pit that would have been the source of the motive power that made the entire works behind me function. Without this part here, none of this would have worked. And the parts of these that survive archaeologically are never quite as impressive as the entire thing would have been originally, but it gives you an idea of the scope and scale of these sorts of structures. This was one of two mills that were built to exploit this canalised water source. This is the site of the Upper Walk Mill, as it was called back then. The Nether Walk Mill was located about 100 metres over that way. That is better understood historically. This one not so much. Despite the fact these being so prominent in the landscape of their time, they very quickly get overbuilt as soon as they move away from the water power to steam power as a source of power. The original water channels tend to get forgotten about and then culverted over. And that entire landscape that would have been so recognisable to the people who lived and worked here is vanished until we come back to look at these things archaeologically. When this was built, there was nothing out here except the hinterland leading towards Rotherham in the north. This now is well within a very, very busy part of the city centre. We're now standing at the northeast corner of what was originally the Upper Walk Mill and got converted into a corn mill by about between 1850 and 1890. That's a rare enough alteration for this type of works. Part of the reason why that changed and why we know about it is because the expanding works next door encroached onto this site. They redrew the boundaries, and Hobson, who was the owner and operator of that steelworks, something of a local industrial powerhouse in himself, bought up more of this land, bought out this place as and rented it on as an asset. Over behind me on this side, you can see this orangey deposit here. It's very characteristic of post-medieval grinding works. That material is called swarf. It's a mixture of the grind dust that comes off the grinding wheels under constant use, mixed with a few particulates of metal from the blades themselves. Pretty horrible stuff to inhale. And that is why if you had this job, you tended to die around about 35, 38 years old, which is rough, but it was also considered quite good for the time for people involved in these sorts of industries. But this material is what we describe as a process residue, effectively. It's not the actual process itself, it's just what accrues in the immediate vicinity and builds up and builds up. It's only not here in greater quantities because, of course, if you just let it build up in lovely stratified layers that archaeologists would love, you pretty soon don't have a functioning workshop anymore. So the immediate locus of the industrial activity is often quite a clean space because they have to move this material out.
What I'm standing on is what we think is a layer of material that was dredged out from the Goit, which was kind of dug out over that side of the site, which was like a little sort of tributary off of the main river that was feeding the water mill. All this stuff that you see in section here is evidence of the use of the site of the mill itself. So this is the material, the swarf that they were is the sort of residue from the grinding process that's kind of been chucked outside, we think, and then compacted down, and it's kind of created this yellowy sort of sandy material. These layers of swarf have just kind of built up over quite a long period of time, and as we think, it's just been chucked outside of the mill. And then this kind of layer of tarmacy kind of gravel up here, we think is just kind of a capping layer above that. So they probably put that in the when the steelworks was extended out onto this part of the site.
The thing that makes Sheffield famous around the world is its knife production technology, which started in the medieval period and is then effectively turbocharged by the amount of materials that are available for production and the skill set that's developed by these people. It's a very, very carefully guarded and managed system that they were managing themselves effectively on an individual person-by-person basis. The amount of work was done by agreement and consensus rather than a centralised authority dictating who did what and when. There was a lot of autonomy embedded within this system of the people who ended up being referred to as little mesters, which is a sort of probably a contraction of the word masters and done to reflect the skill set. And again, the fact that they were basically their own group of identity within the broader industrial landscape in Sheffield. Embedded within this deposit behind me, you do see traces of their work though. The grinding wheels themselves, which are such an iconic part of sites like these, weren't considered vitally important to the people who worked here. It was just their raw materials. It was what they used to do their jobs. And when they fail, they are discarded. Some of them get embedded into the swarf material. Some of them get reused over there. They're embedded into structural elements. Again, later stages reusing the components that then become fossilised in time and available for us to study. We're over here in what we're calling Area A now. This is an area of mitigation specifically targeted to look for the remains of Hobson's steelworks, which was where we really get that massive sea change in the scope and scale of works going on in this part of town. By about 1837, a chap called Hobson sets up business next door on the adjacent site. He's already made money in various other concerns around town. He's proven his ability to make steel, and he gets together quite a bit of capital investment to expand the works over in that direction through this area here. It comes in at a time when water power is starting to lose its primacy and the development into steam power production happens. So that arguably again means that the works over 100 metres or so behind us loses its really key economic power. And then steel making is really taking off at that stage. We're getting a lot of these works developing all around Sheffield. This obliterates earlier property boundaries. We have one early property boundary that we see in other parts of site that's buried under about 1.5 metres of stratigraphy that's built up following the abandonment of that property boundary, and that is specifically because Hobson buys out this land. They build these back-to-back crucible structures that appear on the 1890 map, but were easily constructed about 20-30 years before that. And that's again the reason why we dig up these structures, is because the mapping incidences only provide these tiny windows into a vast range of developing experiences. What you can see behind me are the flues that feed into each of the crucible melting holes. You're taking in raw iron at one end, where we have the cementation furnaces tucked away right down that end on the riverside. Those are the furnaces that convert the iron into a crude form of steel called blister steel. That steel is smashed up, put into lots of crucible pots, and the pots are lowered into these melting holes, producing molten steel that has to be pulled out by hand and poured into the ingot moulds. Hot, dangerous work. It's very easy to get blasé about the process because now we don't do this by hand, but each individual pot would be lowered in and raised out by a guy with some big tongs. And it sounds absolutely terrifying, because it probably was. What you don't see here is the vaulted arch that made part of the cellar. Maybe if you look behind me, you might be able to see a bit of the mortar scarring on the walls that shows where that vaulted arch was. That's been deliberately deconstructed by the end of the use of this structure. They've cracked out the vaulting completely. They've backfilled this entire cellar with a very loose but structurally sound sort of clinker ash furnace rake out material. And then they've built this big sloping wall behind us that you can see. That's a structural underpinning, because they've compromised the load-bearing qualities of this structure in favour of slabbing it over and turning it into usable space for the next phase of steel production that follows on from the 1900s. Okay, we're now down on the cobbled surface that represents an earlier phase of activity that happened about 100 years before the creation of the crucible furnace over on my left side. This cobble floor is one area that's part of an extensive landscape that appeared to have been constructed to go along with a boundary wall. The boundary wall itself is probably a later iteration of an earlier plot boundary. That means that they're starting to colonise this part of town in a much more serious way. They're starting to extract more out of the landscape and turn it into something that is what we would recognise as productive. And this is part of the formative part of that process. Every edge of this cobbled surface pretty much has been nibbled away by the later walls that have come through it. And we have a succession of phases there as well. The later story is that we have the expansion of Hobson's steelworks all around me. We see the earlier phase of it in these beige lime mortared walls on this side of me. We see a late 19th, early 20th century version of that continuing expansion with this wall behind me here. But in the base of this area, it's important to again say that this isn't a cellar floor. This isn't a building that was inhabited. All the walls around me are later. The structures that are embedded within the cobble floor are contemporary within that cobble surface. Because what we have in this area from the 1850 plan is a row of structures. This is where we really need the detail from the archaeology to bring those structural features alive, because on an 1850 map, it's just a series of interconnected boxes. Doesn't tell you much. They could be workshops, they could be domestic dwellings. The real answer is probably a mixture of the two. Whether it's actually a set of steps is potentially interesting, or the base for a set of steps, because that may indicate we may be dealing with some sort of split level terracing here. There's no definitive evidence of that, but it's something to key into our interpretations as we go forward.
From this area we've had things like pottery, a lot of clay pipe. There's quite a whole one here, if you can see that. And classic bits and bobs associated more with a domestic setting. Just here we had a spread of about 9 bone buttons and small slithers of bone where you could see the buttons had been cut out of them. So that was quite interesting.
They're quite enigmatic, but they do still sit within a known set of structures. So we excavate down to these sorts of areas, we record them, and then we do our best to understand them. This site really covers a great deal of scope, a great deal of change that happened in this country. From the 1700s, where you still were dealing with a post-medieval mindset, where much of the land was owned by a landed elite. Then you get the Industrial Revolution happening, and a lot more space is opened up. Land is sold off because the people who own it realise it has a value. They can lease things out to people who will develop it, like this. In this case, we've got an interesting mixed picture, because we've got the upper walk mill over behind me that did start off as a cutlery grinding shop. That's a very typical Sheffield thing, and where we are in town was kind of the northern end of a whole development that spread along the river. So you have the cutlery works developing behind me, you have a successful business that's really nothing to do with the water side anymore. The steelworking can happen anywhere, it just happens to be adjacent to lots of other sites. So it's becoming a known part of town at this stage. It's got communication networks, but it's also got space. And that's why Hobson buys this land out. It's next door to his successful works. This has been fairly sparsely populated, and then it becomes somewhere where you could have the room to grow and develop these massive integrated steelworks that became a standard feature in the landscape by 1850, 1860. They're everywhere, and they're world famous. They're producing a high quality product that is in such demand. You have the long developed skill set from the medieval period on in these centres of technical excellence that suddenly become astronomically productive. But the legacy of these sites is they produce these communication routes. They end up being redeveloped as big flat spaces by the riverside that then have a commercial application into the 21st century. Part of the reason why they're lost is because the people who were directly involved in their production and manufacture, certainly in the period we're looking at, didn't get much of a representation in the historical record in and of themselves. Their identity is bound up within structures and sites like this. We dig them to basically understand how they went about their lives and what their lives were really like and what it actually meant to be in these sorts of environments. They had technical expertise, even though by today's standard they were illiterate. They didn't need to represent their own history because their work was their legacy. And the political and social changes that all that kind of organisation of labour developed into still has very, very clear ramifications with the world we live in today. A lot of the original interest in industrial archaeology was very technical. It would be about recording monuments and sites. It would be about understanding technical processes. But what they amount to is the legacy of the people who worked for a living in these areas.